Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and boy have I got something exciting for you today. We're going to be looking at the VZ-71, also known as the Wolf. This is going to be the Tier 10 Czechoslovakian light tank, and it is going to effectively have a brand new mechanic, at least at high tier. It's going to have autocannons that fire a ridiculously high number of rounds in quick succession, but have tremendously low alpha damages, of which I'm going to be covering today. So to say that I'm excited about this tank is an understatement. I like the way the autocannons felt in Wargaming's fun game modes they've had over the last couple of years, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how they're actually going to go into the game. Now let me clarify, this is currently being super tested, and so as Wargaming will say at the bottom, characteristics are not final, so everything that you see is subject to significant change before we see them going into the game. I guess sometime this year. It's probably going to be maybe 3 to 6 months, I expect, is usually the delay after things hit the super test. So firstly, what gun caliber does this vehicle get? Well, it gets two 57mm guns, and the delay for like an intra-clip reload, it looks like this thing is firing 20 rounds a second. So if it's firing 20 rounds a second, that means that this thing is firing 1,200 rounds per minute. Now I got a question, is that per gun or is that going to be for each of the guns? Well, I guess we can take the clip size, which is 75, we can times it by the alpha damage of the tank, which is 12, to get a 900 damage magazine, where it's going to take 3.75 seconds to deliver that 900 damage. So I'd be very surprised if that was per gun, because that would mean that this vehicle was doing 1,800 damage in 3.75 seconds, which would be very extreme. However, when we look at these kind of statistics, that doesn't make them seem so scary when we think that an AMX 13105 at tier 10 is dealing 390 damage with like a 2.5 second intra-clip reload, meaning that in 5, that tank is doing like 1,170. However, considering the reload of this tank is 15 seconds, and if we add 15 onto that, and then we take 60 and divide it by 18.75, that means this thing is firing 3.2 mags per minute, and if we times it by 900, that means that this tank will have 2,880 effective damage per minute if you're penetrating all of the shots. And that starts to make a lot more sense for a light tank, so it would be very surprising if that was per gun. That is still a staggering amount of damage per minute to have on a light tank, because the Sheridan, if it's penetrating all of its shells with 105mm, can only achieve 2,543. But keep in mind that you're going to be able to use a gun rammer on that tank, and it's unlikely you're going to be able to use one on the Czech light tank. One of the really interesting mechanics of this tank is that, as you can see, the vehicle actually has less alpha damage on its APCR rounds, as we can see down here, than it has on its armor-piercing rounds. So for everyone who has always wanted gold rounds to just do less damage in World of Tanks, well, this is the ticket. And Wargaming have even said that the premium rounds on this tank are going to cost the same as the armor-piercing and the same as the high explosive. Accordingly, this vehicle, it's not going to have gold rounds at all. It's just going to have a special round for when you need to have the extra penetration and have 250mm of pen instead of 190. But to be able to have that 60 extra penetration, you're going to be having to sacrifice 3 alpha damage per shot, which is a quarter of the vehicle's magazine potential. Nevertheless, still, if you sacrifice a quarter of that, that is still going to be some very substantial damage indeed, dealing 675 damage per magazine if you're able to penetrate all of those 75 APCR rounds. Now, the real crazy thing about this tank will be the HE rounds on this tank, because it's 25 damage per shot, which means that you are going to be packing 1,875 damage per magazine, which you will deliver in 3 seconds. Accordingly, if you're able to engage very lightly armored tanks or get right up behind a flat surface that isn't very thick, the possibility of like literally bursting out an entire tank in 3 seconds could be hilarious. And I do hope that Wargaming allow this vehicle to take a significant amount of ammunition to be able to facilitate this process. Clearly, intuition will be incredible on a vehicle like this, and considering it has a 15-second reload currently, the intuition switch time won't even really be all of that long, and switching between an APCR mag or an HE mag will be fantastic. We also need to consider that sometimes that you aren't going to be able to deal decent amounts of damage to your opponents, even with the 250mm of pen, against heavily armored targets. But I can only imagine what 50mm of HE pen will do when you're firing 75 shots at the tank in like 3.5 seconds. Does that mean that you're still going to do, even if you're only doing 2 damage per shot, that's still 150 damage. If you're doing 4 damage per shot, that's 300 damage in that time, blanket firing at an enemy tank. So this brings 2 major questions for these tanks, and that is, how do they damage modules, and will they knock out crew if they manage to penetrate or if the HE shell splashes? Well, currently Wargaming are suggesting that they can damage modules, so it'd be very scary if they do chip amounts of damage to your ammo rack, that's for sure. Wargaming is suggesting they won't be able to knock out crew, but again, everything is currently up for testing. One thing is for certain, that considering this is a tier 10 tank, 190 millimeters of penetration is not very much for the standard rounds of this vehicle. And clearly Wargaming want you loading the gold with a big step up of penetration of 60 millimeters for using those APCR rounds. But you will literally be doing less damage to your opponents. These tanks won't be very good against very heavily armored targets, however, because remember, a lot of the tier 10 light tanks get like 280 millimeters of heat pen, which won't lose any penetration over distance. So with these burst kind of guns, clearly you're not going to be able to just hold down the mouse button and all of the shells go accurately towards the target. You're going to want to kind of burst, let your gun aim, burst, let your gun aim, burst, let your gun aim if you want to engage targets at long range. And so there's probably going to end up being quite a lot of skill in handling the gun in World of Tanks. A lot like if you're kind of like learning the recoil on an AK in a real FPS game. So now that we've talked all about the firepower that this vehicle has, let's talk about the gun handling. 0.4 accuracy, horrible. 2 seconds aim time, that's pretty good. But until we know how bad the bloom after firing is on a tank like this, it's going to be hard to say. I can only imagine that this tank will be mandatory to use vertical stabilizers. Arguably, you want to use a bounty rotation device on it as well. And you might even want to go as far as to using the experimental turbo, which further reduces the bloom after firing, because being able to dump out a magazine without much bloom, if those values are high, is going to be paramount. And I'd like to clarify, the ammo capacity is 1,200 rounds, which means that this vehicle does, if it penetrates all of its standard rounds, does have a significant, like, 15,000 potential damage. But if it's only penetrating its APCR rounds, wow, that's going to drop down to more like about 11 or 12,000 damage. Now onto the mobility of the VZ71. It's a pretty fast light tank, but not incredibly fast. 65 forwards and 25 backwards means it's going to be tenacious. Its specific power ratio of 38 means it is truly a light tank. Its hull traverse and turret traverse 45 and 60 means it is going to be able to re-engage enemy vehicles. Now let's take a look at the survivability. 1,400 hit points. Not bad for a light tank, not really good for a light tank. The armor is negligible. This thing is going to get penetrated by its own HE rounds, and so that'll be kind of a lot of fun. And its concealment rating of 15.22 is actually not very good at all. In fact, that makes it worse than the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen. I'm having to double take here. Yes. Ooh, it's going to have between the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen and the Sheridan levels of camo. That's not looking very good for working the bushes, you know, getting your exhaust, getting your vision system going. And we'll have to see just how chonky this vehicle is. I really hope it isn't chonky, because surely with this tank wanting to fight in close quarters combat, it's going to have to be sneaky enough to be able to get there, or quick enough to be able to get there. And it currently doesn't look like it has either of those two aspects. To make things even worse, the vehicle's view range of 390 means that you're probably not going to be able to sacrifice the view range to increase the camo rating of the vehicle, unless you want to take coated optics on the vehicle, or you've got a mega crew with a premium consumable. And talking about crew, a lot of you will most likely be excited about these vehicles, and especially the tier 10 as well. So what kind of a crew do you have to prepare? Commander, gunner, and a driver on this vehicle. So don't bother with a loader or a radio operator. I expect that the commander will be the radio operator on this vehicle. I expect that the commander and the gunner will probably be the loader, and I think the driver will just be the driver. So if you're planning to invest decent crew members, I would put 0 skill commander, 0 skill gunner, and you probably don't need a 0 skill driver, but if you've got one lying around, it would help. So all in all, the VZ71. Currently, it's looking like a pretty scary vehicle. You know, that 900 damage potential on its AP rounds pretty nice in the 3.5 seconds intra-clip reload that this vehicle has. The possibility of doing more like 1,800 with the HE, that looks like that could be really fun. However, I feel like all in all, for me currently, the tank looks like it's going to be very underwhelming. Statistically, probably one of the weaker tier 10 light tanks. It's not fast, it doesn't have good view range, it doesn't have good camo, it doesn't have good armor, it doesn't have good durability. But one thing that I missed, how did I miss this? 12 degrees of gun depression? Okay, that changes everything. How did I not see this? 12 degrees of gun depression looks amazing. That's going to make this tank very flexible indeed and could make for some real fun moments over ridge lines. Okay, that makes this thing interesting to have. The gun depression of a Kranvang, things are looking a little up. But all in all, still, I don't think that like 2 extra degrees of gun depression over a Rheinmetall Panzerwagen is going to catapult this thing into the echelons of really competitive light tanks. I do expect that we will see some tweaks. I do expect that Wargaming will make this tank better, or I'll just have to wait and see how the vehicle handles on the live server to really get an idea of how that gun blooms out. But currently, they're looking like they have some things to be excited about, but whether this is going to be kind of like the new best bread and butter changes the game completely, I don't think that's going to be the case. And I think traditional autoloaders, like a Batchat or a TVP goes in and it can deal 1,280 damage in 4.5 seconds. This one's dealing 900 with much worse penetration in kind of like 3.75. So is it worth it to have a little bit of extra camo and sacrifice everything else about the tank compared to the TVP? Probably not, unless these vehicles are tiny. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was my look at the VZ71 Wolf. I really hope you enjoyed this video and it was useful for you. If it was, give the video a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know in the comments if you've got any questions about the Czechoslovakian autoloading light tanks, or if you're excited about the VZ71 Wolf. Also, I just noted one important thing. Apparently, they start from tier 8. So that means you're most likely going to have to keep your T-34-100 or uncheck accelerated crew training. But don't quote me on that. Everything is subject to change. And if you're watching this video as it goes live on Friday, I'm going live all day on twitch.tv/QuickyBaby with some brand new drops, as well as testing out the 2 new vehicles that went into the game yesterday. So come along and check out a few games to see if those tanks are worth your attention. If, of course, you missed my tank reviews. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.